To have a carefully planned evaluation in the course of the last 3 years at a well-chosen moment, as a great many economists favored.
This was a well-chosen moment, and it was a carefully planned evaluation.
Surely forced on you at the last minute.
No, certainly not. I've said this before. I don't know why you repeat the question. Don't you believe me?
Well, I was very down after the evaluation for some time, and it took me some time to get over it. I felt it very much as a personal defeat of a policy that I cared about, because I thought it was the way to put Britain on her feet. I had set my heart on trying to fight our way back to parity, and it had failed. And I felt that I was being devalued as well as sterling.
It was said that really for some months you were a devastated figure.
That, I think, is ridiculous. I've never been a devastated figure in my life. I'd hit anybody on the chin who'd said that to me at the time.
Callaghan offered to resign from the cabinet. Instead, he was made Home Secretary.
Could I point out that you have gone down in the cabinet hierarchy from 4th to 8th place, as at present arranged. Does this cause you any pain at all?
Nobody likes going down in the hierarchy, but I guess that if you have got a job to do and the Prime Minister says he wants you to do a job, then you'd better do it.
Callaghan was a popular choice as Home Secretary among policemen. He'd been parliamentary advisor to the Police Federation in opposition. But it was Northern Ireland which posed Callaghan his greatest challenge. When the civil rights marches by the Catholics were brutally broken up by the Protestant police, the B Specials, the province threatened to break down in civil disorder.
When I met Mr. Callaghan, the British Home Secretary, this week, he leaned over the table and he said, Paisley, we are all children of God. And he went on to expound this erroneous theory.
Yeah, I remember that very clearly indeed. It stuck in my mind very much. I was so shocked to hear him say that. Maybe he is correct for all I know about what it says in the good book. But it seemed to me that the way in which he was attacking the Catholics at that time in his private conversation with me went beyond the pale. And that was why I interposed quite gently. Look, Mr. Paisley, aren't we all the children of God? No, he said, we're all the children of wrath. And so I retired at that stage. I wasn't going to embark on a biblical discussion with him.
After visiting Northern Ireland, Callaghan took the momentous decision to send in British troops.
We just told people they were there to restore order, and then, of course, they would return to their barracks. And that was our hope. I never believed it. This is why I disliked so much putting them in. I didn't want to put them in at all. Once you step into the Irish scene, it's very difficult to get out.
And how difficult was it for you to take the decision to commit?
It wasn't difficult in the end, because you had to save and protect people's lives. And so there could be no two ways. The whole of politics is about taking decisions that are either bad or worse. You rarely take good ones. And so in those circumstances where you have to protect people's lives, then you take the decision, then go to troops.
Back in Britain, the trade unions were now locked in conflict with the Wilson government. They bitterly opposed its plan to curb their powers by law. And Callaghan, himself the long-time ally of the unions, led a cabinet revolt against Barbara Castle's in-place-of-strike proposals. And according to one of her cabinet colleagues, Callaghan cheerfully admitted that he was stabbing Mrs. Castle and her allies in the back.
Oh, well, I might well have said that in the heat of the moment. I know about stabbing them in the back, I was stabbing them in the front. Everything was displayed. Yes.
But what Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle say is that if you had been able to bring in that legislation to reform the trade unions, then Labour wouldn't have lost the 1970 election.
Well, that's what they say. I don't believe it. I don't think the legislation would have worked, and it would have been seen not to have worked on illegal strikes at that time.
You didn't see an irony in the fact that you opposed the legislation to reform the trade unions, and yet 10 years later, it was the power of the trade unions that helped push you out of office as Prime
Oh,
Minister.
there is an irony about that, of course, because I thought the trade unions, this is one of the reasons I was opposed to it, that, what was the man's name who was the chairman of the Royal Commission?
The Donovan report.
Donovan report. Donovan said the unions should reform themselves, and he specifically did not recommend legislation. He specifically recommended against legislation. So it wasn't that I was just standing Callaghan on the burning deck, and there was the whole weight of a Royal Commission behind me.
With Labour in opposition after its 1970 election defeat, Callaghan had more time to spend on his Sussex farm. He'd become a more relaxed figure and had seemed to relinquish his leadership ambitions after a prostate operation. But his political skills were on display immediately after the February 1974 election. There was a hung parliament, but the Tory Prime Minister Ted Heath remained closeted inside number 10, even though he'd won 4 fewer seats than Labour. As Heath sought to fix up a deal with the Liberals, Callaghan advised his own colleagues to stay silent.
I remember using the phrase, let Ted swing slowly in the wind. I thought he would twist and swing, and eventually he would have to give up, and indeed he did. And then we were able to step in. But in my capacity as chairman of the party that year, I did a lot of things by stopping broadcasts of some of our people anxious to get on the television and the radio in order to make great denunciations. I actually stopped one team halfway in their tracks going down to see one of our people, and they turned round again.
So you stopped a television team that was going to interview one of the Labour front benches?
They're going to interview Harold, as a matter of fact. I didn't tell him at the time that I'd stopped it.
And why did you stop?
Because I thought Harold would be making all sorts of declarations about what Ted ought to do, and I was in favour of saying nothing. So I abused my position as chairman by turning the television crew back, literally halfway down it.
Heath had eventually given up his attempt to hold on to power, and 4 days after the election, Harold Wilson was back as Prime Minister. And he won a tiny overall majority in a second general election that year. His confidence in Callaghan had been restored, and he gave him the Foreign Office, where Callaghan could make full use of his negotiating techniques and skills as a tactician. One early test came with the erratic Ugandan dictator, the self-promoted General Idi Amin. Amin threatened to execute Dennis Hills, a British lecturer living in Uganda, for insulting him. Hills became the subject of an intense diplomatic battle between Callaghan and Amin.
If Foreign Secretary is not here within 10 days from tomorrow, we will then consider when to execute Hills by the firing squad.
I decided that I would risk my reputation such as it was, that I couldn't really allow that to happen without making a personal approach to Amin. And so I said to Harold Wilson, as Prime Minister, Harold, I'd like to go. He did not dissent. He thought I was being very impetuous, and he was right. But I went. It was quite an extraordinary experience.
Morning.
Amin was a big chap. He was a little taller than me, about 6'2", and huge, bear-like embrace. He threw his arms all around me. And pretty well his first words to me were, when I knew you came from Cardiff, I decided I would release Hills too. And I said, why? Well, he said, you have the Olympic swimming pool in Cardiff, and when I was training for the Olympics, I used to come to Cardiff from London every weekend and swim there. And I thought, well, that's as good a reason as any, if you want to find an excuse. And he then produced Hills to me. Hills was blinking literally in the unaccustomed daylight. And so I sort of played up, you know, in the sort of rather melodramatic atmosphere.
And you know that I am pro-Britain.
And we then all set off for the airport, except that Amin insisted that he himself would drive me to the airport. And we got into a green Mercedes, and we didn't go the same way as the others. And I began to wonder whether I was being taken hostage instead of Hills. But he drove me to an African hut where his mother and some other old ladies were squatting on the floor. We had to duck under a very low entrance to get in, and I was introduced to his mother and to these other old ladies, and I sat on a stool for a little while. And of course my staff at the airport were getting absolutely wondered what on earth to do. They were so agitated at my disappearance. And eventually he drove us up, ignoring all traffic lights and the rest of it, and drove straight through them to the airport, and I rejoined the party, and he said farewell.
Callaghan enjoyed a moment of tangible diplomatic success, but he faced a much harder task on his return. The Wilson cabinet was split down the middle over Britain's membership of the common market. While some were ardent pro-Europeans, others passionately wanted us to pull out. Callaghan himself had shifted from his former pro-market position.
But if we have to prove our Europeanism by accepting that French is the dominant language in the community, then my answer is quite clear. And I will say it in French in order to prevent any misunderstanding. Non, merci beaucoup.
To hold the Labour Party together, the cabinet had agreed that Callaghan should seek to renegotiate the terms of Britain's common market entry. He was a British version of General de Gaulle in the cartoonist's eyes. Callaghan arrived in Brussels to begin the renegotiations with what The Economist magazine described as all the delicacy of a man setting up a fried bacon stall outside a synagogue. It was a revealing illustration of his negotiating techniques.
It was necessary at the very first meeting to make it clear that we were in earnest. It's like when you join the Navy. In the first fortnight, the leading seaman who's in charge of you will make your life absolute hell. And then you think, my goodness, what have I come into? After that, you find he eases the screw off a bit. And you find that perhaps he's rather human after all, and you manage to get along together. With the foreign ministers' negotiations, it was necessary at the very first meeting to make it clear, in the interest of our government, we only had a majority of 4, had to make it very clear that there were certain things I was really going to go for. After that, you could ease the screw and get along a little better. It was all part of the negotiating techniques that everybody has. All those people who fell down and worshipped in front of the European community, as so many people did uncritically at the time, ridiculously uncritically, including The Economist and people like that, they, of course, would make the most of it. But then they said the same thing about Mrs. Thatcher, didn't they?
But how much was this stance that you adopted for domestic consumption at home, that you were absolutely determined to show how tough you were being?
Of course, you had to address 2 audiences, and sometimes it's very difficult to address 2 audiences. You had to address the foreign audience, and you had to address your own domestic audience. But Jimmy Maxton, you remember the old ILP member, he gave the final definition of that. He said, if you can't ride 2 horses at the same time, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus.
Callaghan and Wilson had pulled off the trick of holding the cabinet together and keeping Britain in the common market. Callaghan had now become Wilson's heir apparent. And in 1976, Harold Wilson astounded the country by suddenly resigning as Prime Minister.
I'm constantly asked, even now, what was the real reason for Harold Wilson's resignation? As though there is some conspiracy yet to be revealed, some mystery still to be unfolded. I regard that as absolute bunkum. Harold resigned because he had seen enough, he had done enough, he was feeling undoubtedly fatigued by the task itself, and he also very wisely said, look, I've seen all these problems before as Prime Minister, they're coming round a second time. Politics is circular, it's the same old problems come round. Again, and I don't want, he said to me, I don't want the fact that I've seen them before and therefore think I know what is practical and impractical to decide the issue. They ought to be looked at with a fresh eye and in a fresh way again, which was very, very sound of him. And I believe that the reason for his resignation were the reasons that he gave.
I suppose the speculation about why he resigned has been fueled both by the revelations of what the security services or an element of the security services may have been up to during that time, and also the somewhat dubious associates who surfaced in his final honours list?
I think as far as the security services were concerned, it now seems clear that there was a small group. I'd never heard of that man who wrote the book.
Peter Wright.
Peter Wright. I'd never heard of Peter Wright in my life until he surfaced with this book years later. And there obviously was a small group. It was not the official policy of the intelligence services to destabilize a Labour government, but there was a group of hard cases there who were acting on their own. And in the intelligence services, there's a great deal of acting on your own. And it may be that that kind of character did spread rumours about the Prime Minister. Knowing what we now know about them, it seems to me highly likely.
The other element which fueled the speculation were the sort of businessmen who Harold Wilson nominated in his final honours list, which seemed to...
Well, that was not a list that I had anything to do with. I don't know about that.
But that was what gave...
I see.
Fuel to that speculation. Moving on to that election campaign for the leadership itself, were you convinced that you were going to win?
Yes, I thought I would win. Indeed, I was fairly certain I would win. I was someone in the Labour Party who had been through every corner and cranny of it, and I think they felt they wanted something like that at the time.
The secondary schoolboy had easily beaten 4 Oxford graduates for the leadership: Foote, Healy, Jenkins and Benn. He'd now achieved a unique historical record, the only man ever to have held all the 4 great offices of state.
I must tell you, there is no other feeling in the world like it. To be sitting in the seat of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, with all the history, all the tradition, all the background, all the responsibility, all the possibilities that offers to you. And I'm bound to say, after I became leader, for about the first 3 weeks, when somebody said Prime Minister to me, I used to look over my shoulder to see where Harold was, because we all got so used to him, you see.
Did you have any doubts about your ability to do the job as Prime Minister?
I'm going to be very arrogant. I must say I had no doubts at all about my capacity to become Prime Minister of our country. I had seen how it had been conducted by others, both with Mr. Attlee and with Harold Wilson directly. I'd seen how other Conservative Prime Ministers had conducted it. I had been a senior minister, and so I knew roughly what was involved, and I took it on with complete confidence. As a matter of fact, it's not altogether a very difficult job to do if you use elementary common sense, have a knowledge of how your fellow men and women think and feel. I'm bound to start with our economic prospects. You know, as I do, that we face 2 deep-seated problems: inflation and unemployment. Both of them are still too high. The first 2 people I saw when I became Prime Minister, after I appointed ministers, was the Governor of the Bank of England and Jack Jones, who was the General Secretary of the T&G. And what I heard made my hair stand on end.
Callaghan discovered he'd inherited a country that seemed to be heading fast towards bankruptcy, with inflation at 30% and sterling in crisis again. He applied for a massive loan from the International Monetary Fund in Washington. But when the IMF demanded swinging cuts in public spending in return, left-wing members of the cabinet put up their own alternative proposals for a siege economy. Although the Chancellor, Denis Healey, believed there was no alternative to the IMF deal, the cabinet was deeply divided, and Callaghan himself feared becoming another Ramsay MacDonald, Labour's first Prime Minister, accused of betraying his party to the bankers.
I decided to have a series of cabinet meetings and allow every member to put in papers to the cabinet, which wasn't really heard of. Tony Benn and all the rest of them, you know, those who wanted to, they put in their papers, to have them discussed by the cabinet, and to allow anybody who put in a paper to be cross-examined by his colleagues so that they could see then what was the strength or weakness of his proposals. I went through all that exercise, and at the end I had a united cabinet. But at one stage I thought that it would be too difficult and that we might even have a 1931 situation, you know. I was determined to avoid it, and I'm a child of 1931. I saw how that government broke up. I was just coming to manhood at that time.
Some of us, in order to perform that national duty, have had to risk everything that is dear to a public man. But believe me, none of us, in order to perform this national service, has departed from principle or has forfeited allegiance.
I used the IMF as a convenient screen. People would put it the other way, and it's difficult to prove it either way. Some people would say we were just creatures in the hands of the IMF. In fact, as far as I was concerned, the IMF was a very useful creature for me to get this through, because if somebody from outside was saying you're not going to get the resources you want unless you do this, how much stronger the position is, you see.
To get what through?
Well, to get through the cuts in public expenditure that were needed. Because, you know, every cabinet, and especially a Labour cabinet, wants to spend on health and on education and social services. Very difficult to get these things through. And secondly, because we wanted confidence to be restored by getting the backing of the IMF for funds that we didn't necessarily use, but for people to know they were there.
The IMF loan brought Callaghan a breathing space. And as Labour's fortunes improved, he confided he saw himself as Moses, who would lead the British people into the promised land. Callaghan was enjoying the perks of prime ministerial office. At Chequers, he celebrated his 40th wedding anniversary with his children and his grandchildren. He'd become skilled at projecting a Sonny Jim image.
You're going to be a film star, are you?
But some of his cabinet colleagues had experienced a less genial side to his character.
Ice cream for those who smile after lunch.
Roy Jenkins said that you have an avuncular persuasiveness flavoured with a dash of menace.
Yes, that's possibly true. I could be very menacing if I set out to be.
Yet you seem a lot of the time to cover that menace with a sort of bonhomie.
What do they say about the iron fist in the velvet glove? I always thought there was a good basic historical tradition for that way of proceeding.
But I suppose the suggestion is made that you appear agreeable, affable and so on, but underneath it you can be, as they say, bullying and petulant.
I think there's some degree of truth in that. But I never like to bully people who can't answer back. I only believe in bullying people like you or others who are my equals. I don't believe in bullying your inferiors. Inferiors in status, I mean. I don't mean in intelligence or anything else. But those who serve you should not be bullied.
But by the autumn of 1978, Callaghan had to decide whether to call a general election. He went to speak at the TUC.
Now, I understand the reasons for the present speculation about the prospect of a general election.
Callaghan teased his long-time allies in the trades unions about his election intentions with a music hall song.
As far as I remember, it went like this. There was I, waiting at the church. And perhaps you recall how it went on. All at once, he sent me round a note. Here's the very note. This is what he wrote. Can't get away to marry you today. My wife won't let me.
Well, I thought that gave a pretty clear indication I wasn't going to have an election, but somehow they took it the other way.
I suppose some people interpreted not that there wouldn't be an election, but that when the election came, Mrs. Thatcher would be left waiting at the altar.
I see, yes. Well, obviously it's capable of many interpretations. Another example of never tell a joke. You'll only get it wrong somewhere among some people.
But Callaghan was in trouble with the unions from the moment he decided against an autumn election. He sought to impose a 5% pay limit, but the unions weren't having it.
I've been in over 15 years.
You will get over 74 pounds.
But Mr. Callaghan, we're due the average wage, which is £78.
The winter of discontent began with a lorry driver's strike. But the Prime Minister had flown to the Caribbean. Callaghan was attending an international summit meeting. But the newspapers caught him at sea. Callaghan tried to laugh it off on his return to London.
And you know, I actually swam. And I know that's the most exciting thing of the visit. But no, I think you should put all that kind of criticism in perspective. And one mustn't allow jealousy to dissuade you from doing what you know is the best thing.
But what is your general approach and view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment?
Well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos.
Well, that was true. We hadn't got into the depths of it then. It was an Evening Standard reporter who was asking the question, and they no doubt wanted a particular headline. They got it.
Crisis? What crisis?
Yes, that's right. I'd just returned from overnight. It was from Guadeloupe, where we had been discussing issues that were of the greatest significance to me at the time, although obviously not to the person who was suffering from the effects of a lorry strike. And there's always a danger, therefore, of a Prime Minister getting it out of proportion when he gets back home. His people aren't thinking about whether we have the Trident C4 missile or not. They're thinking about, is this bus going to arrive on time? So I got that wrong.
I mean, it did look as if here you were, you'd come back. There'd been pictures on the television of you in the Caribbean.
They were set up, you know. Yes, they were set up when I was approached by two busty young ladies. The newspapers wanted to get a good photograph, and so they got a good one, which they reproduced. And it was snowing in Britain, you see.
Do you remember what it was like at the beginning of '79?
Crisis? What crisis?
The rubbish piled high in the streets, ambulances left unmanned, the dead unburied.
Well, some of the things that went on were quite disgraceful. Well, it was the refusal to bury people. I thought it was quite disgraceful, and I thought the trade union leaders at the time did not live up to their responsibilities. They should have told their members it was disgraceful and they should get on with their job. There were the hospital workers who immediately they put in a claim, turned off the heating boilers in a hospital. I was disgusted with the behaviour of trade unionists who did that sort of thing. Mind you, they weren't real trade unionists. And the kind of trade union atmosphere in which I was brought up would never have allowed that kind of thing to happen.
Jim Callaghan had founded his career to a very large extent on being the mouthpiece and the support of the trade union movement. He worked more closely with the trade union leaders, probably, than anybody had since Ernest Bevin, anyone who was a major politician. And then in the winter of discontent, they betrayed him. They turned on him and lost that election. Must, I think, have been an agonizing, very traumatic time for him.
I think Roy sums it up better than I could have done. I wouldn't use the word betrayed. I think that some of the trade union leaders, or most of the trade union leaders certainly felt as deeply as I did about it, but they didn't have the capacity to lead. There was an air of madness overtook people at that time, together with political inspiration by the militants and Trotskyites, no doubt about that, leading their rank-and-file followers.
He says it must have been an agonizing time for you.
Oh, it was the last couple of months, of course, because I saw things were going utterly wrong and there didn't seem to be any way of repairing it at the time.
Exactly 13 years ago, Labour's last Prime Minister made his final exit from Number 10. The man who'd built his reputation as the keeper of the cloth cap had been brought down by his own side. His was the first of Labour's 4 successive general election defeats.
There you are. All right. Thank you, good.
But last month, Lord Callaghan celebrated his 80th birthday. In the House of Lords, just before the general election campaign began, the mood was jubilant. None of the guests then believed that Jim Callaghan was in danger of achieving a melancholy historic record. that he could turn out to be Labour's last ever Prime Minister. Although in retrospect, there's a prophetic poignancy about the occasion.
Remembering, of course, that when I met him first, he was the age I am now. And I must say, in the intervening 3 decades, I've aged a hell of a lot more than he has. I've learned a few lessons of leadership as well from Jim Callaghan. For instance, think twice before you put anybody like Neil Kinnock on the front bench.
When we had the Queen's Silver Jubilee, there was a dinner in Buckingham Palace. This is between ourselves, of course. And after dinner, I saw Harold Macmillan. He said, you know, although things seem going pretty well now, he said, squalls do blow up. And I want you to know, dear boy, that if I can be of any help to you when you run into those squalls, please don't hesitate to call upon me and I shall be with you straight away. So, Neil, I want you to beware. When you are safely installed in number 10, don't be surprised to find me on the doorstep one morning saying, dear boy, if I can be of any help to you, please don't hesitate to call on me.